The image that may define the summer of 2026 in Russia does not come from the front line. It does not show a drone strike, a destroyed tank, or a collapsed bridge. It shows a line of cars, ordinary Russian cars, civilian vehicles, queued outside a Rosneft filling station in Moscow on June 27, 2026, waiting for gasoline in a country that sits on the world's largest natural gas reserves and among its top 5 oil producers. 2 days later, on June 29th, Vladimir Putin sat down for a state television interview and said something no Russian president had ever said in the full 4 years of this war. He admitted it. He acknowledged on camera to a reporter whose job is to make him look capable and in control that Ukrainian drone strikes on Russian energy infrastructure had led to fuel shortages. He called it a temporary deficit. He promised it would be fixed. He said all damaged facilities were being restored quite quickly. But the fact that he said anything at all is the most important sentence in this story, because Vladimir Putin does not concede ground in public unless the ground is already gone. His own spokeswoman, Margarita Simonyan, might frame this as transparency. Analysts who study Kremlin communication patterns see it differently. Margarita Zavadskaya, senior research fellow at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs, told Al Jazeera that Putin was forced to make this admission because the fuel shortages had become too visible to deny. A complete denial, she said, would have looked implausible and would have incurred even higher reputation costs. The cars in the queue outside the Rosneft station on June 27th are the reason Vladimir Putin had to say the word shortage on state television. Ukraine put them there. Part 2. The anatomy of a fuel crisis. To understand how Ukraine got a Russian president to publicly concede economic damage on live television, you have to understand what this campaign has actually done to Russia's refining infrastructure over the past year. It did not begin with a single decisive strike. It began with a strategic choice made sometime in 2025 to stop treating Russian oil facilities as secondary targets and start treating them as the primary economic artery they actually are. Oil and gas revenues account for roughly 25% of Russia's state budget, according to analysis from the Adapt Institute, not a marginal revenue line. A quarter of the entire budget funding a war that, according to various estimates, is now costing Russia an amount per day that would have seemed extraordinary even at the start of the invasion. Ukraine's campaign began hitting refineries in meaningful volume in August 2025, and by the height of the strikes between August and October of that year, an independent oil analyst named Boris Ehrenstein described it to Reuters as the most severe crisis in recent years, noting that the size, coordination, and repeated waves of drone attacks made it almost impossible for Russia to repair facilities before the next strike arrived. At the peak of that campaign, Ukrainian strikes reduced Russian oil refining by close to a fifth on some individual days, according to Reuters. Russia managed to absorb that initial campaign through what Carnegie Endowment analysts describe as redundancy, spare capacity left over from Soviet-era infrastructure built for higher demand levels, allowing refineries to shift load while damaged units were repaired. But then Ukraine resumed strikes in mid-March 2026 with renewed intensity, and this time it went after the export infrastructure itself. The Ust-Luga terminal on the Baltic Sea, which handles a significant share of Russia's seaborne oil exports alongside the nearby Primorsk facility, took repeated strikes in late March 2026. A major strike on Primorsk on March 29th ignited fires in storage tanks that burned for several days. Attacks on Ust-Luga in the same period halted oil loading entirely for 9 days. The Adapt Institute, drawing on shipping data, estimated that at the most intense 2 weeks of Baltic terminal strikes, the number of loaded oil tankers leaving Russian ports dropped by half. The Kyiv School of Economics reported that strikes on Rosneft's plant in Tuapse on the Black Sea caused such extensive damage that Russia may have to fully rebuild the facility, potentially at a cost of $5 billion. $5 billion for one refinery. That is not a repair bill, that is a reconstruction project. Part 3. The refinery inside the capital. Of everything Ukraine has struck in this campaign, one target carries more symbolic weight than any other, and it is not in the Urals or the Krasnodar region or the Baltic coast. It is 15 kilometers from the Kremlin. The Kapotnya oil refinery sits in the southeastern suburbs of Moscow itself. one of two processing units the facility modernized in 2020 when it consolidated from multiple smaller units into two large integrated installations positioned close together. Carnegie Endowment analysts noted the bitter irony of that modernization in their June 2026 assessment. In peacetime, the consolidation made economic sense, improving efficiency and reducing operating costs. In wartime, it created two adjacent high-value targets instead of several dispersed ones, and it did not occur to anyone at the time that they might someday need to worry about drones. On June 12, 2026, one or more drones struck a refining unit at Kapotnia. 6 days later, on June 18th, 5 or more drones hit the refinery's only remaining refining unit, along with storage facilities for both crude oil and finished oil products. Both of the plant's primary refining units had now been struck in a city ringed with some of the densest air defenses anywhere on Earth. Carnegie's own assessment of this strike used language that is striking in its plainness for an institution not known for dramatic framing. The successful strikes on the Kapotnia refinery, it wrote, signaled a new phase in Ukraine's campaign against the Russian oil industry. Significantly, they showed that not even the heavy air defenses around Moscow can stop drones getting through. That sentence deserves to be read twice. Moscow's air defenses are not a ceiling on what Ukraine can reach. They are a filter. And a drone that costs a few $1,000s has proven twice in the same week that it can pass through that filter and hit a facility inside the capital of the country that launched this war. Part 4. The numbers that tell the story. The fuel crisis, now visible in queuing Moscow motorists and Putin's televised admissions, is not the result of any single dramatic event. It is the accumulated output of a campaign that, by the metrics available to outside analysts, has run further and hit harder than almost anyone predicted when it began. Adapt Institute analysis published in April 2026 estimated that by the end of March, nearly 40% of Russia's total oil export capacity was regularly out of service as a result of damage to transportation infrastructure. 40%, not a temporary disruption affecting one facility or one port. 2/5 of the country's oil export logistics consistently unavailable week after week as Ukraine's production lines kept generating the drones and missiles to sustain the pressure. Bloomberg data cited in Foreign Policy's May 2026 analysis put average Russian oil refinery output at 4.69 million barrels per day in April, the lowest recorded figure since December 2009. Russia's seaborne oil shipments dropped by approximately 300,000 barrels per day in March 2026 relative to prior periods, a decline Carnegie and Baker Institute analysts tied directly to the Baltic terminal strikes. The Adapt Institute's March 2026 estimate put the revenue cost of just the Baltic terminal strikes at roughly $1 billion in lost potential revenue in a single month. Alexei Zabatkin, the deputy governor of Russia's own central bank, told reporters that operating the fuel sector below full capacity for several months would likely reduce the country's GDP growth this year. Russia's central bank had already forecast GDP growth of between 0.5 and 1.5% for 2026, a figure that, even before these admissions, was among the weakest in the recent post-war period. Harvard researcher Craig Kennedy provided the most specific number in this picture. For Russia to meet its 2026 budget targets without spending cuts, global oil prices would need to average $115 per barrel by the end of the year. Oil is not trading at $115 per barrel. The gap between what Russia needs and what it is earning is being widened month by Ukrainian drones hitting the infrastructure that converts Russian crude into both the revenue that funds the war and the fuel that drives its vehicles. Part 5. How Ukraine outpaced Russia in its own war. One of the most quietly significant data points of this entire campaign came in March 2026, when a threshold was crossed that nobody would have predicted at the start of the full-scale invasion. For the first time since the war began in February 2022, Ukraine launched more drones in a single month than Russia did. Ukraine deployed 7,347 drones in March 2026. Russia deployed 6,462. A country of 44 million people with a fraction of Russia's pre-war military budget, fighting on its own soil against a larger aggressor, outpaced that aggressor in the single most decisive weapons category of the entire war. Ukraine maintained an average production rate of more than 200 long-range strike drones per day throughout March, according to Adapt Institute Analysis, a figure that reflects both the scale of Ukraine's domestic production base and its deliberate decentralization of that production across hundreds of separate sites and companies to ensure Russian strikes cannot shut it down in a single wave. That decentralization is itself a strategic answer to the problem Russia has tried to solve on the Ukrainian side by hitting energy infrastructure repeatedly. Russia has struck Ukrainian power generation relentlessly throughout the war, reducing the country's generating capacity from 33.7 gigawatts before the invasion to approximately 14 gigawatts by early 2026, according to energy consultant Oleksandr Karchenko, cited by The Economist. Ukraine responded not by trying to protect every facility, which was impossible, but by distributing its drone manufacturing so thoroughly across so many sites that destroying any individual one has limited effect on total output. The contrast with Russia's own industrial vulnerability is stark. Russia's refineries cannot be distributed. A distillation tower sits where it was built, connected to the pipelines and ports that give it its economic purpose. The Kapotnya refinery cannot be moved 15 kilometers east to get away from Ukrainian drones. The Tuapse plant on the Black Sea cannot be relocated inland. Ukraine found an asymmetry and built an entire industrial strategy around it. Its most important weapons can be made anywhere. Russia's most important economic infrastructure cannot be hidden anywhere. Part 6. The political cost Putin can't absorb on a spreadsheet. Beyond the economic data, Ukraine's energy strike campaign has inflicted a cost on the Kremlin that does not show up easily in revenue figures or refinery output tables, but may ultimately matter more than any of them. It has made the war visible inside Russia itself, in the daily lives of ordinary Russian citizens who have, for 4 years, been shielded from its consequences by a combination of wartime censorship, managed distance, and a government that worked extremely hard to frame events in Ukraine as something happening somewhere else. The majority of Russia's regions have introduced limits on the sale of petrol and diesel. Indra Overland of the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs told Al Jazeera in late June 2026. Some gas stations have shut down or have queues, he added, and the impact on the domestic economy is growing by the day. Zavodskaya of the Finnish Institute of International Affairs described the political effect with a precision that deserves attention. The impact, she said, is mostly attritional, cumulative, and politically corrosive rather than immediately destabilizing. It is unlikely to produce regime collapse or mass revolutionary dynamics. That is the honest version of what this campaign can and cannot do. It will not topple Putin. It will not produce a revolution. What it will do, what it is already doing according to the analysts closest to this data, is make the war increasingly difficult for the Kremlin to manage as a domestic political proposition, as ordinary Russians who did not ask for this war and do not think of themselves as being at war are forced to queue for fuel in Moscow and read about petrol rationing in regions they have always thought of as safely distant from the front. Putin's own public admission on June 29th is a direct measure of how far that erosion has already come. A Russian president who has spent 4 years refusing to say the word war publicly, calling it instead a special military operation, sat down on state television and told the country that Ukraine's drone strikes had created a fuel shortage, not a technical malfunction, not an unspecified disruption, a shortage caused by strikes. That is not the language of a government that has the situation contained. Part 7. What cannot be stopped, and what can the title of this script makes a claim that demands honest scrutiny. Can Putin actually not stop this? The Carnegie Endowment, which has provided some of the most rigorous independent analysis of Ukraine's energy campaign throughout 2026, is careful about overclaiming. It notes that Russia has proven adaptable, using Soviet-era spare capacity to absorb initial damage, shifting crude flows between facilities, and initiating emergency repairs at a pace that has surprised some analysts. The Ryazan refinery north of Moscow, one of the primary fuel arteries serving the capital, has been struck by Ukrainian drones 15 separate times. It is still operating. Damaged refining units under repeated stress do degrade structurally, Carnegie notes, and emergency repairs conducted under wartime conditions reduce the long-term integrity of the equipment, but that is a slow accumulation of vulnerability, not an immediate shutdown. Russia can also, and has begun to, import fuel from Kazakhstan and other partners to compensate for domestic refining shortfalls, the same kind of adaptive workaround it has found for Western technology sanctions throughout the war. So what exactly cannot be stopped? What cannot be stopped is the fundamental cost equation. A Ukrainian drone that costs a few $1,000s striking a distillation unit that costs hundreds of millions to repair, repeatedly, faster than the repair cycle can keep pace, and across a geography so vast that comprehensive air defense coverage of every relevant facility is simply not achievable, given the total number of air defense assets Russia has available without stripping coverage from the front line or from Moscow itself. Defense Express analysis of the Titan Barakati strike in June noted explicitly that Russia had been redeploying air defense assets toward the capital, leaving major industrial facilities at greater exposure than a year earlier. That trade-off, protect Moscow or protect the refineries or protect the front, is not a problem Russia can solve with more resources alone, because the distribution of targets Ukraine can now reach spans thousands of kilometers, and no country in history has ever found an affordable way to put an air defense umbrella over everything simultaneously. What Ukraine has built in this campaign is not a single weapon or a single tactic. It is a cost machine designed to impose a specific kind of economic and political strain that formal sanctions, trade restrictions, and diplomatic pressure never quite managed to generate in 4 years of trying. The cars queuing outside the Rosneft station in Moscow on June 27th are the most visible output of that machine. Putin's admission 2 days later is the political output. The gap between $115 oil and whatever price the market is actually paying is the budget output. And somewhere over Russian airspace tonight, more drones are flying toward facilities whose coordinates were selected because hitting them will add something to each of those three numbers at once. The machine is still running, and the man who launched this war is telling his own citizens on state television that he is working on it.